Hey, this is Darren. In this episode of the X Files, or maybe since there's only one of us here, we'll just do a regular pod. We'll dedicate this to my partner in crime, who's preoccupied at the moment with what's going on in Belarus. Um, they just had a recent election there where there was a claim, well, rather a universal claim of fraudulent elections. Um, they've had a dictatorship for some time now. They've had a number of people arrested, riots in the streets with regularity on a daily basis since the election. And the opponent has relocated, whether by force or by choice, to I believe it's Lithuania. So there's a lot of aggression in the streets there at the moment. And Oleg, my general partner in crime, hasn't been available for reasons fairly pronounced. They have had their internet shut down, um, though he's been able to reach out in a number of different ways. So, I mean, what we're going to do is that brings up a valid point that I wanted to discuss. Um, I'd rather have Oleg here to discuss it with, but that being said, um, I wrote an article in March, right after this started, the pandemic, called Crisis Stages. And what I found is that most of the crisis stages that I predicted have been pretty accurate, including the one that I'm going to talk about. One of the things that we had mentioned was in stage 5, where there's an explosion of gradual or pockets of sudden and unpredictable aggression or conflict or violence, or crime or what have you. And where I think was wrong, where I was wrong with that in hindsight, is that those elements are very location specific. And as we've progressed, they've become intricately more detailed depending on the area that you're in. As we're seeing in Belarus, it's uh, an issue of freedom of speech. It's an issue of election tampering and the people's voice not being heard. It's freedom of the internet, where their internet has been shut down so that the rest of the world has limited accessibility to what is going on within the country. It is aggression and torture and violence against a protesting public, whether it's been peaceful or aggressive in nature, that protesting. So, I mean, I'm going to discuss a little from my area. I mean, I keep hearing about from a lot of self-defense people about the coming wave of violence or the coming storm. And I think that needs to be put in context. Um, Here in Costa Rica, there is, based on historical development, um, a lack of that element. We haven't had our civil wars here the way that they've had in the surrounding countries. The wave of violence here has been progressive and not nearly at the level as some of the neighbors have had it. They don't have and haven't had for a long time a dictatorship. There's no military here that gets involved in public interaction. Um, so, I mean, Ticos by nature also aren't the type that go out in the streets and riot violently. It's a well-educated society generally that resorts to different methods of getting their voice across in more subtle ways. So we here have not seen some big explosion of violence. Actually, quite the contrary. A lot of the lower end poor class population have been out in the streets peddling their wares, selling wherever they can on street corners, selling sweets or fruits or plants or herbs that they've made in their backyard. So I mean, while that may change on a long enough timeline, and these things may evolve to the thing that we had originally predicted, it hasn't happened as of yet. So talking from my perspective in this country, I know the police, because of budget cuts and a number of other elements, having been overworked, are complaining that the murder rate here is skyrocketing, and it's drawn a lot of panic both from law enforcement, the government, and the general public. And while I get that budget cuts, concern over returning tourism, overwork, and underpay from staff or force, um, I don't see personally that exponentially greater fear to this point. The murder rate in the country here is up, but only exponentially from last year. We're within the range that we've been the last few years. And while that is fairly high, usually a yearly, an annual rate of around 500 to 600, which is, I mean, uh, 10 over 10, I think it's almost 11 per 100,000, which is considered by the murder index on a global scale to be exorbitantly high. It hasn't risen dramatically from that average. Um, and considering that we're only proportionately ahead of last year's pace, considering that we're in a pandemic or crisis where the unemployment rate is at a historical high, the last rate 2 months ago was at 24%. Not including part-timers, not including little micro markets that are happening, little micro economies and little black markets where people make money on the side. It's probably closer to 40, 45. Considering that historic high, that people are on edge, that virus numbers are going up, that poverty and homelessness numbers are going up, I'd say, and noting that respectfully, that any murder rate is not good news. That's not bad considering the situation that we're in. We have 14 more murders at this point of this year than we did last year. That's hardly an explosion, especially after a 4.5 month pandemic. And like I said before, it's not to say at all that a wave may not be coming at some point as this draws on indefinitely. But so far, we haven't had that. And on a bigger country where pockets of that violence are exploding, it also doesn't mean that the entire country has exploded with that element. So, I mean, remember that crime changes as society changes. So I think that was one thing that in that 0.5 that I made in that article in March, it pays to delve a little bit more in deeply. Crime changes as society changes. More people are working from home, online, staying in, therefore have their cash supply, their pocket money, their tech at home. And crime evolves to meet those changing dynamics. And I think it pays to analyze that to become grounded in one's approach and not be taken over by some wave of panic or paranoia, which seems to be omnipresent on the internet. So, I mean, here in Costa Rica, here's where I see an increase in violent crime or crime coming either in the future months or that's already been accounted for in present. One of the main ones is domestic violence. Couples are trapped in their homes for long periods of time on end, what with the lockdowns and quarantines and driving restrictions and working from home, without the ability to separate if stress rises exponentially. This also explains the increase in murders in the country while the general drug-related ones have gone down during the pandemic. The overall level has been maintained, and one would think that if the drug-related murders and gang activity has lowered, that the murder rate would lower as well. Here's one area where it has risen. And this isn't random street attack or mass social unrest. This is the known quantity that you live with, whether it's one side or the other, even though one side is dramatically bigger than the other. Which leads me to the next one. There's been an uptick in femicides as well, killing of women, animosity towards women. When there's an aggressive man at home or alcohol and drug and aggression levels go up and there's no football here as a release for a lot of macho men the next thing to do is to take that aggression out on the one that one is capable of taking it out on. Whether that be at the home or outside in a social setting. So we've seen domestic violence rise. We've seen femicides rise. We've seen missing women and child trafficking being on the increase. Here, extremely poor families, even at the best of time, have been known to sell or rent their young daughters to foreigners, usually rich, single, older foreign men for extra or desperation money, whether temporarily or permanently. Now, whatever you label it, it's sexual assault, it's human trafficking, it's prostitution, it's rape, it's, however you want to stack it up. There have been a growing number of women that have subtly gone missing here already since the pandemic started. A lot of that starts from the home or from organized rings. So it's not the opportunistic mass social unrest that we see. It's the known quantity that's picking up its pace and taking advantage of the current situation of things. Another one that's been on the rise has been home invasions and robberies. So as people are home more during the lockdowns and the quarantines and the driving restrictions, they have their pocket money, their cell phones, their laptops, their PCs, their credit cards on them at home. They're also a mechanism that can help show a group where the valuables are and be used as a pawn for leverage. So there has been a rise of home attacks or home invasions as this has progressed. Expats are a notorious target for that. And part of that reason already is they've segregated themselves in their own communities. They have gated communities, security outside that is being paid minimally and can either themselves, their group, or attract people from the town, break in and take advantage of prior knowledge about when people aren't going to be there, what houses contain what. So, I mean, that's another element as well. A lot of these expat communities isolate and ostracize themselves from the rest of the community and that they don't speak Spanish. They showcase money. They live only amongst themselves. They don't interact with the locals. A lot of that happens here. Another place where crime has increased exponentially is online identity theft, hacking, phishing scams. People now en masse being online and working from home with the governmental and health protocols have drawn a lot more of that internet hacking and illegal activity, identity theft element. We here have had a number of these as well. We've had phone scams. We've had a number in the country already that start off from one of the major local penitentiaries where convicts get their one phone call. They falsely represent government agencies to get your banking information and to send them money, claiming to be a government organization or a tax department or a fines department where you owe money for something and need to send them your banking information. These last two here, these the home invasions and robberies, the online identity theft and phone scams and these things will continue to grow as long as there's a reliance on that working from home element and home-based business. And they've generally been successful thus far. They've accumulated, I think the last check about a month ago, I had been informed that they had collected over $25,000 from that particular phone scam, which may seem like nothing, but that's a pretty big amount here and one that's worthwhile to partake in the activity and the risk that goes involved with it. Another element that we're seeing, at least here, is police corruption. There's always been that element present in Central America. What I've seen on the local crime pages is a non-addressing of called-in crime, where police don't show up at all when somebody has claimed home invasion or a robbery or something of the sort. There's no showing up. even violent crime has drawn some apathy and ambivalence from local departments. There have been a number of bribe stops where police or a duo of police act independently from their job and pick a random spot where there's side traffic coming through to get to a main thoroughfare, and they check to see that you've got all your emergency equipment or your license and registration on you. Or they pull over a foreigner and they'll ask for a payoff or a shakedown or intimate some transfer of something of value to get them off your back is worth it. Some have had theft at the crime scenes as well. It happens here, and it did pre-pandemic as well, but it'll happen more now as law enforcement budgets, as we stated previously, have been cut, and officers are working longer hours and under far more pressure to control certain elements of these crimes. This one is from home or from your car. Yeah, and you're noticing that there's a routine here. This isn't mass social unrest. These are things that happen online or at your home or in your car. So I mean, there's a growing routine there, and the antithesis is always to believe that I'm safe as long as I'm home, and if I go out, that's where the risk is. But a lot of what we're seeing emanates from people being at home, and I'm not sure if people are generally aware of that or not, or have put their finger on that. But I think it's worth pointing out that because you're at home more often, a lot of crime and risk and threats can happen while you're at home. And I don't mean to fearmonger there, but that's kind of the reality, is that we're seeing a lot of these things we've mentioned have been the result of people being in more, not going out and having street violence or social unrest. We've had some social unrest here where certain entities like the bus drivers, police, certain other elements have protested or complained about getting more money. Taxi drivers as well, though there's generally no more money to give. There's people that at this point in time, pensions are at risk as the healthcare system deteriorates and demands more money to be filtered into different areas to keep society going and to keep the economy afloat here. The risk of losing one's lifetime pension at the end of life is in the air at the moment for this generation. So, I mean, those are some concerns. We've had protests, generally peaceful, in front of the presidential home and parliament. What's the equivalent of parliament here? But they haven't caused a lot of explosivity. They've been fairly controlled, and their point of reference on the videos that you see is not based on anything grounded. So that's another element. Here, as I've mentioned before, the fall from dangling on the end of that precarious rope of stability and financial stability is far greater a fall than it was in Canada. So, I mean, as time goes on, desperation kind of hits home, where normal, average people suffer from things that affect their well-being on a far greater level than it would in certain first world countries. So you have things like poverty and hunger and homelessness and losing life savings and having your business fold. You have things like suicide and depression and elements like these skyrocket. And in a very macho-driven society, that machismo is propagated by both sexes in a very pronounced, deep-seated way. You run the risk of not having an outlet to express those things here the way that you would in North America, where it's more acceptable to admit that, hey, I'm not doing okay. Hey, I might need some extra help here. Hey, I need to talk to somebody about this. Here, that machismo can be a very double-sided sword, where men simply refuse to get help when they're struggling, or even acknowledge that they're struggling in the first place to anybody. So, that stoicism runs the risk of causing a lot greater self-harm than it would otherwise. And note as well that suicide is also generally considered a violent crime, though it be to self. It's also a knee-jerk reaction to take yourself out of a situation that can have a domino effect on a number of other people. Should men of the house, or working parents, or single income households, or dual income households where the woman works as well, have one of those members take themselves out of the equation, you're taking an income stream away from an already precarious situation where people are dangling to economic viability. So there's also that as well. Catching the virus, whether you think it's potentially lethal or not, can also take an income out of the equation. Should you be risk-taking in your social interaction? Medical bills add up as well for those who are needing hospitalization or emergency room treatment. The cost here at some hospitals can be egregious for a lower middle class or a lower class family. And it can make the difference between being viable or not being viable. So, I mean, those things have to be taken into effect too, in terms of the ripple effect that they contain on certain households and certain dynamics in society and society in general as these numbers go up. You're also starting to see a trend here where lower class or poor class people, average law-abiding citizens, are hitting a point of desperation. So they're needing to resort to crime themselves without being the victims of it. They themselves are becoming active in the criminal element out of desperation, or they're being recruited by organizations. You're seeing some of these narcotics organizations or illegal activity organizations that are recruiting average everyday people, not people that are generally affiliated with crime at another time. But because of that desperation, these organizations are capitalizing on it. So those are certain areas to pay attention to as well as time progresses. Those are some elements that I'm seeing here, and you'll notice none of these is with a mass shift in violent crime or a mass social unrest or street crime that's increasing by unknown agents by surprise out of desperation. Most of these are generated out of the home or from elements that come from out of the home. So, I mean, that's an important distinction here that I don't think a lot of people are assessing or breaking down. For me, I think it's important for me to have my finger on the pulse of what exactly is increasing and what is not. What is the reality of my current situation and what is not. And every location is different. In a country as big as the US or Canada, that little micro area can be a lot finer. When you have such a vast area, a vast type of people. I mean, if you have 50 states, those are tons of different demographics that may be feeling the heat here in a very different way from a neighbor. So to hear that, hey, my doctor friend from South Connecticut tells me that this is all a fraud, that may be his reality or her reality in Connecticut, but it doesn't reflect the entire rest of the country. Just like the violent crime statistics don't really give a breakdown on what is precisely happening and where. But we tend to lump it all together where, I mean, even the police here, because of these budget cuts, have had an open dialogue via the media saying that, hey, we need money because the murder rate is going up and somebody has to take care of the bodies and do the crime scene work and all these things. Yet when you look at the statistics and break them down, that increase hasn't shot up that greatly compared to last year, knock on wood. those activities that you say are burning you out have always been part of the job. They're not a new thing that people are doing now and partaking in. Drug-related murders at this point have actually gone down, as both the pandemic has kept people inside and that these drug organizations have realized that it's really bad press and causes problems with drawing attention of the wrong kind from rivals or from police forces that may interfere with the fluidity of their business. So, I mean, those are important things to analyze when you're analyzing your local issues related to this. And yet, media and politicians tend to project this on a mass scale, that this is what is happening everywhere, so this is what we have to prepare for. And that simply isn't the truth. That's not how all this works. I watch and pay attention to very little media now when I'm assessing the violent crime or the crime in general in the country. I just find that it's not beneficial. I don't do the hyperbole thing. I don't do the fear mongering, and I don't jump when people tell me to jump. So another thing is not reading the comments below those articles either, because they tend to be inflamed and provocative, because they're taking that bait from that media and reacting based on emotion, or what we call here based on the liver. You're thinking with the liver, with anger or fear. So, I mean, those are things that I look at the data, I look at the information, I look at the statistics, I look at the anecdotes, I look at the crime pages, I look at reputable news sources, and between all of these different elements, you get a much better and more grounded gauge of what's actually happening and when. And you can start to see patterns forming too, where even these elements of social unrest, where there are protests or demonstrations or even sometimes riots, can be acknowledged previously. If you know where to look online, you can see where these things are going to be happening. You can see what areas to avoid that day if you need to go out. You can see where the activity is going to be. You can see if there's a number of different areas where these things are going to be taking place, and react accordingly. They're all out in the open. Very rarely are these things sporadic and suddenly explosive, at least here at this point. They're pre-planned in advance to get the maximum number of people. And everybody knows the game. The police know that these things are happening. The people know these things are happening. The government knows these things are happening. And what happens after that point is based on those three elements: understanding the dynamic and being able to act rationally and manage that conflict element and keep things more passive. So far here, that's been the case. But as we've seen in numerous other places, we've seen, I believe it's in Chile, in Mexico, in Peru, Brazil, India, you've seen a lot of unrest. Belarus right now, you're seeing a lot of unrest due to very diverse elements that are taking place, whether it's distrust in your government, whether it's your government's apathy towards your personal safety and the propagation of misinformation, whether political bodies are making some kind of a power play at this point and the people catch it. Whether there's tribalism and separation of groups of people for a greater intended purpose. Those are things that people need to keep their finger on the pulse of. Even being near to that kind of an element brings bilateral effects to a secondary country. Here in Costa Rica, one of our closest neighbor is Nicaragua. And Costa Rica and Nicaragua have traditionally had a very tense, unstable relationship. As Nicaragua is now a dictatorship, and we see that a number of these discrepancies have taken place here that have increased the tension between the two countries. There have been food blockages at the border from Nicaragua. A number of semi-trailers that are bringing food to Costa Rica have been stopped indefinitely at the border out of a resentment and a tension of the previous relationship. So that food hasn't made it across. Refugees from Nicaragua that are coming back from other places trying to get into Nicaragua, or those that have come illegally here and being sent back, are not being accepted. So they're stuck in an inevitable purgatory at the border, where conditions aren't the greatest. Their own country is not allowing their citizens to come back, and so on and so forth. We've had El Salvador state that our numbers are way off, that we're lying, and that there's been an actual explosion of cases and a lot more people have passed and been victims of the virus than we've been letting on, as their numbers have increased. So, I mean, the region has generally been unstable, and we are inevitably affected by these other countries. I mean, it's a small region where every country is a very small size, and they affect the other countries in the region as a byproduct of their own decision making. There have been a number of Nicaraguans that have snuck across the border out of desperation to make money at jobs here that traditionally Costa Ricans do not want, or to get health care that their own government is not providing them. So, I mean, that has created a number of different infections and created a higher number of mortalities here. Yet, these people are in desperation based on what's happening in their government. And considering we don't have a military, the border is inevitably uncontrolled. So we're at minimal capability to stop these people from coming across the border, which is a sad dynamic for both countries. So, I mean, we're affected by the instability there and by the instability of certain elements in Panama as well. And considering the region has a history of dictatorship and instability, that's an element that's always present too, where governments are making power plays to ensure their position in a time of vulnerability where a lot of people are suffering. And that's going on everywhere in the world as well. So, I mean, these are elements that pay attention to. They pay to keep your finger on the pulse of. They pay to acknowledge in your region and actually your life. Where we live is generally safer than some other parts in the country. But I have to constantly be aware, and have been for 10 years now, that I'm a light-haired, blue-eyed Canadian that lives in a lower middle to lower class barrio or neighborhood here, and I stand out. And even in the best of times, there is resentment towards foreigners, especially first world foreigners, especially during a pandemic. So, I mean, those are things that I have to factor into my day-to-day as well, that I stand out rather predominantly here. It's not like somebody from New Hampshire moving to British Columbia. So, I mean, that's something I have to constantly be aware of. So I know the area, I know the routes, I know my patterns, and I know times, and I know all of these different elements that I have for a decade now on how to up the percentage of my survivability or safety and my family's. So I mean, that hasn't changed a lot as I've had great exposure and experience over those 10 years. I'm not changing a lot. I was already kind of marked or stood out somewhat for those 10 years, that this isn't a big shift for me where it would be for somebody who's been here for a year. or somebody who's been here from another Latino country or another Central American country. You can blend in much easier that way. So, I mean, I'm not going to get too far into this, but what I wanted to do was dedicate this to Oleg and hope that he's safe and that his family is safe and that they're going to ride out the storm. And it led me to delve down certain of these lines based on what's happening to him, how we perceive the current threat and how that changes. Their threat in Belarus changed. They also saw some patterns developing. They knew the election was coming up. They knew there was going to be conflict. They knew that there were going to be one of two outcomes, and one was extremely more likely than the other. So it's not like there was no prep and there was no understanding that these potentialities could happen. So there's some prep that society can do leading up to that. Again, it wasn't completely by surprise. Now, I mean, the threats that we mentioned there are not threats that we had anticipated prior to the pandemic. Now, these events, these such that are happening in Belarus and the ones we've mentioned in Central America here, are not happening simply because of the pandemic. You can't chalk everything up to the pandemic. But we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that this, as a time on the human history line, isn't a wonderful opportunity to cause unrest and segregation and separation between groups of people, between governments, to make political plays, to capitalize on private information personally, to create a number of different reasons to take away certain rights or freedoms. And that shouldn't be lost on us as time progresses. That's why I continually tell people, if the mask is where you draw your line in the sand, you're going to have trouble with a lot of things coming up in the future. There are much bigger fish to fry coming up down the road. And I don't mean that coming violent storm. I mean far more important human rights and freedoms and restrictions that are coming up. Not because of the pandemic, but because of the human element taking advantage of the pandemic. I think that's also a discrepancy that needs to be made. The pandemic and a global crisis are a wonderful time to change societal dynamics, to get people to draw lines in the sand, to get people to adhere to their emotions and biases. And we're seeing that play out. And that's a major thing. And I think personally, what I see is a lot of people misunderstanding what that coming storm is going to be. I don't believe that the major one is going to be of violence. I believe that the major one is going to be one of human rights and privacy and speech and personal information. Those are issues that will be coming around the corner eventually. And I think it pays to pay attention to that, which is why I think critical thinking and adaptability and decision-making, rational decision-making, and resilience are so important. And it's why, to me, I sometimes get so frustrated seeing people not exuding any of those in their comments on social media. So, I mean, if you can get one thing, if you've made it to the end of this podcast, it's that. Make sure that there's a balance between what is conspiratorial and what is critical. Make sure that you have grounded footing on what the safety and risk and threat issues are going to be coming around the corner. Make sure that you're noticing the changing patterns of media reports, of political direction, of medical development, of scientific understanding. Make sure that you understand these processes. Make sure that your opinions on social media are reflective of somebody who's cautious and not quick to get people to share inaccurate information or to project fear-mongering or sensationalism. Make sure that you're controlled and disciplined in your posts, that they're not created to incite or invoke something. Remember that you, as a potential influencer on social media, have a responsibility of calm and containment with trying to get followers and people that pay attention intimately to your opinion to make their own assessments and pay attention to their own lives and areas, and not just take your opinion at face value because of who or what you are or have been. And we'll leave it on that note. If anybody has any comments on this pod, feel free to reach out, and here's to hoping that the next pod or sometime in the near future that my partner in crime will be back and safe and sound, and we'll be able to continue on with this platform that we've been developing here. Enjoy your weekend, everybody.